Hi, and welcome to another edition of Infrastructure for the Future. We're here today with Tyler Bender and Peter Garretson to talk about the intersection of geopolitics and space, specifically the international order that has been a bedrock of US influence since the late 1940s, and how the US leadership in that system has created the world that we live in, and how that system, as we move into space, may not be exactly what is needed and may not be up to the challenge. And so we're going to talk about what that international order looks like, what the challenges are to it from competitors, and what policy options there are available to the US to be able to ensure that whether it's free and fair democratic systems we support, the free flow of trade and economics around the world, extends into space, and that we're not pushed back into this mercantilist or peer competitive mode that existed prior to the world wars, prior to the turn of the 20th century. And so it's exciting to be able to talk with both Tyler, a policy analyst with Beyond Earth, and Peter Garretson from realistically, if you are in this space and you don't know Peter Garretson, there's a handful of books you need to pick up. His name's are on the cover, but he is a analyst that really undersells his work at the American Foreign Policy Council, where he focuses on space and defense. So first up, we'll hear from Tyler. Tyler's a Marine Corps veteran with long history working in broadband telecommunications. He has a master's in international relations from the Joseph Goebbels School and University of Denver, where he looked at the intersection of US foreign policy and global economics. Tyler's a former independent candidate for US Congress, where among other things, he advocated for ending the partisan gridlock and reinforcing US leadership in the effort to expand humanity's presence in outer space. So we're excited to have you here, Tyler. The screen is yours.
All right, Tim, thanks for having me. Also, thanks for the invitation to speak on two topics I'm passionate about, which is US global leadership and outer space. I'm going to share my screen here. All right, so the US-led international order, why we made it and how it relates to space. So before we get too far into things, I should explain what I mean when I say the US-led international order. So also called the post-World War II international order, the liberal international order, or the rules-based international order. And this is my definition. I define the liberal US-led international order as a loose collection of internationally accepted norms and institutions established by the United States and its allies at the end of World War II, which espouses liberal values of state sovereignty, cooperation between nation states, democracy, human rights, free markets, free trade, and the rule of law, all underpinned by the social and cultural influence of the West, the strength of the US economy and the US dollar, and the military power of the United States and its vast system of military alliances. Now, to understand why the United States made the international order, you need to understand the context that led to its creation. So we're going to rewind to the late 19th, early 20th centuries, a period that was characterized by the waning of British power and constant economic and political instability. So the economic order of the time was based on the gold standard led by the British, but it was quickly fracturing. But at the same time, you still had a strict adherence to the gold standard and was being prioritized over social stability. So you had falling wages, rising prices for goods, rising unemployment, rising inequality, and economic disruption, such as the Panic of 1873, which was a global depression that lasted for 20 years in the United Kingdom. And this economic This economic instability led to rising populism and rejection of globalization as it existed at the time. In addition, you had little political order at the international level. So the United States, although it was a rising power, remained isolationist, partly because it had economic problems of its own, with 10 recessions between 1873 and 1913. And you also had Europe constantly at war, with at least 17 conflicts on the continent within the 19th century alone. And this all led to an unstable balance of power, and where the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914 set off a diplomatic disaster that eventually led to World War I. So Austria-Hungary wanted to invade Serbia in retaliation for the assassination because they blamed Serbia. Germany feared that Russia would mobilize in response to Austria's invasion of Serbia, so they attacked France in hopes of a swift victory. But then the British became involved and thus began World War I, which was essentially a 4-year stalemate that was broken only by the entry of the United States in 1917 and resulted in 18 million dead with 20 million wounded in a new era of warfare, where you had mass mobilization of popular armies with modern weaponry. Then followed the interwar years, which continued political, economic, and political instability. So the Treaty of Versailles formally ended the war on June 28, 1919, 5 years to the day after Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, but it failed to restore the international order. Mostly because, although the ostensible goal of the Treaty of Versailles was a return to peace, the explicit goal of the French in signing the treaty was pain for Germany, and this was not helpful. At the same time, you had America returning to isolationism by refusing to join the League of Nations, even though it was kind of our idea. And at the same time, you had rising inequality and economic disruption, most notably the stock market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression of 1929 to 1939. So once again, you had economic instability leading to rising populism and rejection of globalization. And we saw the rise of socialism on the left and the rise of fascism on the right, in its most extreme form in Nazi Germany, where Hitler rose to power and eventually invaded Poland in 1939 to begin World War II. World War II was once again a European conflict that the isolationist United States tried to stay out of, but was drawn in, of course, with the attacks on Pearl Harbor. And by the end of the war in 1945, the world had seen 60 million dead, 45 million of which were civilians, and another 25 million people wounded. Then finally learning lessons of the past, the United States began working with its allies, primarily the United Kingdom, before World War II even ended, to establish a framework for international stability. And this included economic institutions, most notably those created by the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944, which created the International Monetary Fund, which provides short-term lending for economic crises, the World Bank, which provides longer-term lending for development in low-income states, and the Global Agreement on Trades and Tariffs, which is now the World Trade Organization, which encourages multilateral cooperation to expand trade, resolve trade disputes, and reduce protectionism. Now, these economic institutions are all part of what the economist John Ruggie referred to as the embedded liberal compromise, where you still see a commitment to free markets, but at the same time, states maintain a broader commitment to social welfare and full unemployment. And in addition to these economic institutions, we also have political institutions, such as the consensus building abilities of the United States, the United States alliance system, and the United States military power, and of course, the United Nations, which was created in 1945 with purposes that include maintaining international peace and security, and achieving international cooperation and solving international problems of an economic, social, cultural, or humanitarian character. Now, as in the past, the United States does not lead the international order wholly out of enlightened self-interest. There were strategic considerations in creating the post-World War II international order, such as our interest in balancing against Soviet power and the spread of communism. But the order remains intact after 75 years and has had many successes. One of those, of course, being the victory in the Cold War, which brought the end of totalitarianism with the fall of the Soviet Union. And despite the Cold War, has been an absence of great power warfare for the past 75 years, which is unprecedented in world history. We've also seen, which contributes to a historical reduction in global conflict deaths over time. We've also seen a growth of democracy, whereas in 1945, 30% of governments were democratic, close to 60% are democratic today, although this has backslid in recent years. But this increasing stability has led to economic growth. So we've seen global GDP rise from 9.25 trillion in 1950 to over 100 trillion in 2015. And this contributed to a decrease in global poverty, where 1 billion people have been brought out of extreme poverty since 1990. And to break up the monotony of my slides, I'm going to bring in some visual aids just to really bring the numbers home. So World War II had 60 million dead all told, and that's decreased significantly since then. So of course we had the Korean War, many casualties there, Vietnam War, casualties there, the Iran and Iraq War in the 1980s, but we've seen a gradual decline in that time, even despite conflicts in the Middle East that continue today, such as in Syria and Yemen. But overall, conflict-related deaths have dropped significantly. And then just to bring the point home of the exponential growth of the global economy, you see global GDP really unchanged until a few decades before 1950. It's really escalated significantly since then, all because of the globalized economy. But although the international order has had successes, it is also facing threats. We could go back as far as the 1970s to address these threats, but I'm going to stick with the 21st century. Starting with the 2003 invasion of Iraq, which violated state sovereignty, which is a fundamental principle of the international order, disregarded the United Nations, and unilaterally imposed democracy, all for weapons of mass destruction that we found were not even there. Then you had the 2008 global financial crisis, which originated in the United States with the collapse of our housing bubble, but quickly spread to a global recession. And this was seen as a neglect of our financial responsibility as the most important economy in the world. Then you also have unequal gains from globalization. And this is where we've seen a neglect of the embedded liberal compromise and a return to prioritizing the market over society. So although we've had more global trade and investment, we've seen little help with the adjustment costs of economic change, such as jobs lost to automation and trade. And this had a real impact on wages. So although US GDP per capita has risen from 28,000 in 1980 to 56,000 today, and this is in 2010 dollars, in that same time, the median wage for men has fallen by 6%. We've also seen rising inequality across countries in the West, including countries such as egalitarian Sweden. And as seen in the past, economic disruption has led to rising populism and rejection of globalization. So we've seen a recurring pattern here. Another threat to the international order is our withdrawal from the Iran nuclear agreement and our withdrawal from Afghanistan. So in abandoning the Iran nuclear agreement, that did nothing to slow Iran's progress towards obtaining a nuclear weapon, and for them to do so would, of course, make the Middle East even more unstable than it is today. And our 20-year state-building adventure ended with the Taliban returning right back to power. Now both withdrawals damage the credibility of the United States and signal to our allies and our adversaries that the United States could abandon its commitment at any time it chooses without any regard for the consequences. Another threat to the international order is the tension between state sovereignty and human rights. So in the case of China, the Uyghurs, for example, China has sovereignty over what happens with its domestic affairs, but when those domestic affairs impede on people's human rights, what do you do? There's just constant tension there. And finally, what I think is the biggest threat to the US-led international order is political dysfunction in the United States. And I'm not going to get into the politics of this, but I think it's safe to say that the United States is not providing a very good example as the leader of the free world. And that brings us to outer space, which I see as a new frontier to revive US leadership and the international order. Yes, there are problems on Earth, but space is a domain where I see we can utilize to address those problems. One example being climate change, where monitoring weather patterns and tracking progress in reducing carbon emissions relies on satellites that are orbiting the planet as we speak. And enabling growth of the space economy creates new markets, which creates new jobs. And in the case of the space economy, we're talking high skill, high paying jobs, because building satellites, building robots that operate on the lunar surface, that requires high skill to build those kinds of things. And just like global trade across the seas, where safe passage is guaranteed by the United States, the space economy requires predictability and stability. And this requires establishing responsible norms of behavior. And the United States has already taken steps in this direction, such as the tenets of responsible behavior that were released by the DoD in July. We also need to address space traffic management and orbital debris mitigation in space, with space becoming quickly more and more congested. And the United States has also taken steps in this direction with plans to move at least civil space traffic management to the Department of Commerce, but progress in this area has been slow, although there are some steps in that direction. And finally, space is an opportunity to continue and expand international cooperation. For example, the International Space Station, where we have cooperated with Russia for nearly 20 years, despite our many, many disagreements on the surface of the Earth. But we need to start talking about what comes after the International Space Station. It is getting old. They're hoped to maintain its operation until 2030, 24 at the latest, but we need to start talking about what comes after that as far as the commercial side. What commercial companies, I know there are plans in progress, but we need to guarantee that there's a commercial option before we retire the ISS, so we have a presence in low Earth orbit. And then finally, we have the Artemis Accords, where the United States is using its consensus building abilities to draw in international partners in lunar activities that will be in accordance with the principles of the Outer Space Treaty. And the Artemis program to establish a peaceful and sustainable presence on the lunar surface is noteworthy, but we have to make it back to the moon in a timely manner, and we need to stick with the plan, or we risk being passed up by China and Russia with their own plans for an international lunar research station. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Tyler. That was a great overview of sort of how we've gotten to where we're at, and what that's looked like over the past 100 years. I know many of us, when we look out across the world, we don't necessarily associate institutions like International Monetary Fund, World Bank, with these pillars of a system that has preserved peace and stability for an unprecedented amount of time. We tend to look at the Iraq War, Afghanistan, and other small conflicts and think war is all over the place. It happens all the time, but it's been the better part of 100 years since a major power conflict, and that's in no small part because of this system that was put in place at the end of World War II. So thank you for that. I now want to turn to Peter. Peter is, as I mentioned earlier, a senior fellow in defense studies at the American Foreign Policy Council and a strategy consultant who focuses on the intersection of space and defense. He's the co-author of Scramble for the Skies, the great power competition to control the resources of outer space. And he hosts the American Foreign Policy Council's Space Strategy podcast. We'll have the links to both of those put in the description for this video so you all can see them. I encourage you to check them both out. Foundational reading on the part of the book, and the podcast is an amazing insight into how decision makers are thinking throughout government when it comes to space strategy. Prior to joining AFPC, Peter Garretson was a colonel in the Air Force with a long history of strategy and policy advising. I won't list all of his accomplishments because we only have a finite amount of time, but he has been either the lead author or key contributor on a number of strategic documents, including the 2011 National Military Strategy, the first Air Force Unmanned Aerial System Flight Plan, Directed Energy Task Force, DARPA 100-year Starship, Pentagon Study on Space Solar Power. It goes on and on. Short version, Peter is an accomplished policy author with an eye towards space and the challenges the US faces. So over to you, Peter.
So thank you, Tim. So, and thank you also, Tyler, for setting it up so well to get started here. So, as Tim mentioned, I am the author of a book on this subject, and I run a weekly podcast on the subject. So I encourage you to check it out if anything I say is of interest. So here are some key takeaways. Great power competition is likely to impact your future and your children's future, whether or not you live in a first or second rate nation, whether or not you live in a free or controlled world. The central competition is over space resources and the space means of production, by which I mean the moon and asteroids and their resources for in-space manufacturing. China is moving aggressively to shape this future, and the US must lead or live in a future shaped by China. And you have personal agency to help decide our collective fate. So I'm going to talk this in a series of 10 hard truths. So the first one is we are in a new era of strategic competition. And the image I like the most here is the one on the right, because I really think it's a long-term contest of strength and endurance rather than something that's going to end up in actual fighting. But it's important to realize that this strategic competition is across the board. It's in military, whether it be naval vessels, submarines, missiles, fighters, bombers, drones, and satellites. It's economic in terms of trade infrastructure, trade agreements and global infrastructure. It's diplomatic in terms of alternate governance and seats across the board in attempting to garner votes in the United Nations. It's coalitional based on projects and loans. And it is control of the future means of the economy, the means of production and transportation, meaning global infrastructure, ICT technology, 5G, artificial intelligence, surveillance technology, vehicles, as well as the control of critical things such as rare earth minerals and the flow of critical energy resources. Hard truth number 3 is that it is, in fact, based on some level of adversarial and enmity. So there are numerous books, I put up some of them, that establish how deep within the PRC society their suspicion and dislike of our way of doing things and their desire to replace our order with something that is more comfortable to them and its strategic consequences for us. And I would point out that some of these are extremely credible authors. Michael Pillsbury is among the most respected China watchers. General Spalding returned fairly recently from being the defense attaché in Beijing. And Jonathan Ward's book is just fantastic. All right, and then we have to face the reality that our competitor is extremely well resourced. That when it comes to purchasing power parity, China's economy is already larger, and they're projected to be larger than us, in just a few years in terms of absolute GDP. Now, the next hard truth is that space is a central and perhaps the central theater to the new great game. And that's the subject of the book that I mentioned. So let's talk a little bit about the geostrategic importance of space resources. So nations care a lot about relative power, and they pay particular attention to relative economic growth. So, typically when people attempt to rank great powers, they're concerned with the size of population and territory, resource endowment, economic capability, military strength, and they care about production in terms of land, labor, capital, tools, and energy. And the bottom line is that the resources of the solar system offer states the opportunity to change all of these, including the size of their population and territory, their resource endowment, their economic capability, and as a result, their military strength. So just to give you a scale for what I'm going to tell you next, the whole world GDP is about 100 trillion, and the United States is about a fifth that, just under 20 trillion, and our debt is about the same. Our federal budget is just under 4 trillion, and our defense budget is under 1. The largest market capitalization of Apple was 1 trillion, and the richest person is about 160 trillion. And we have about 8 billion people on the planet and use about 18 terawatts of all forms of energy. Now, space is certainly expected to grow from approximately 400 billion today to 2050 estimates of about 3 trillion on our side, and China is expecting about 3 times that of $10 trillion. But these estimates really don't account for, and space research just dwarf these estimates. So an individual asteroid can vastly exceed $1 trillion in terms of its current market value, meaning that if you were to try to get the resources that are contained in one, you would have to spend that amount at today's prices. And this one pictured here at right, which is one of the smaller asteroids in its class, is estimated to contain about 20 trillion worth of valuable minerals. And that is bigger than the gross domestic product of Japan, Germany, the UK, France, and India combined. 200 times more than all the gold mined in the California gold rush. Just a moment here. So there are 830 asteroids valued in excess of $1 trillion. At least 500 of those valued in excess of 100 trillion. And the largest 16 Psyche over 10,000 quadrillion dollars. There's also the possibility to increase living space. The asteroids contain sufficient material to build over 3,000 times the livable surface area of Earth, and the asteroid belt could support a population of 10 million billion people, depending only on the sun for power. So the energy wealth is, just enormous. As I mentioned today, we use about 18 trillion for all human civilization. Much more than that strikes the disk of the Earth. An incredibly amount more comes out of the sun. And if we were to do what I'm going to tell you about what the PRC is trying to do, there are about 331 terawatts of electrical power in geostationary orbit alone that could be delivered by solar power satellites, which would completely eliminate climate change several times over. And it means a much larger global product, that $1 trillion of electric power supports approximately, 1 terawatt supports approximately $42 trillion of economic productivity. So that exploiting just the resource in geo would mean 166 times larger global GDP. This is all going to be made possible by in-space manufacturing that allows us to construct very large things from space resources in space, as well as very, very large habitats eventually. And this is the infrastructure that both sides are starting to nip at with their very nascent programs. But it is an exponential process which will lead to as big a change as we had in the first industrial revolution, and a massive return on investment as we exploited the new world. So this leads to a competitive vision of how do you enable this space mining in order to build the green energy system of tomorrow. And we're facing a similar sort of time as when the United States was competing with other powers for the Pacific in terms of how we established the chain of islands that led to what eventually became a tremendous amount of trade across the Pacific. And here is sort of a picture of the developing space lines of commerce between the Earth and the Moon, and the flow of material that, like across the Pacific, is going to make a big difference, with a vision of what we expect the cislunar economy to initially develop, as well as the sorts of government things that are going to need to be provided in order to make use of all that. Now, the hard truth number 6 is that we are in a new space race, though it's really more of a scramble and a struggle than a race. And it's important to understand just how broad and incredible what China is doing in this. So just in the past year, they successfully landed on the South Pole and the Moon, pulled a lunar sample, brought that lunar sample back to Earth, a very complex procedure. They got into Mars orbit, succeeded in landing, succeeded in putting out a rover and taking this selfie at the bottom, and of launching and constructing their initial space station and putting on their first long duration crew for 6 months. Now, they're also attempting to attack satellites, and there are a lot of ways to attack satellites. China is basically working down the list. So, of course, in 2007, they did their first direct anti-satellite missile, which they've since deployed. They've tested it all the way out to geostationary orbit. They are working on co-orbital anti-satellite capabilities, of which they have just launched another one with claims that they can melt a satellite on orbit. They are working on lasers against satellites. They have been implicated in hacking of United States satellites. They are working on space-to-ground attack vehicles and missiles, as you saw just tested with the fractional orbital bombardment system, and trans-atmospheric vehicles as a fast follower to what we're doing in SpaceX. So they are both fast following. There's the espionage threat, and the leads that we think we have are likely to evaporate quickly. They're contesting across the board global standards and services, including their alternative to GPS that they have linked into their One Belt, One Road, their space information corridor, which is linked to the One Belt, One Road to provide space services and lock countries in to their country champions and their ICT infrastructure. They're contesting diplomatically. They are opening up their space station to all nations of the world to provide and host scientific experiments. They do capacity building with developing nations. They have released a roadmap with Russia for what they call an International Lunar Research Station. That's quite well thought out and quite ambitious. They're working on in-space nuclear power and propulsion. They're working on kilometer scale ultra-large spacecraft. And they are working very specifically on space solar power. They have the most advanced and well-financed space solar power program there, which is the future technology for energy. And they are looking to capture the means of production. They want to go after asteroids. They want to be able to deflect asteroids. And they're very interested in occupying strategic terrain, as well as accelerating their ability to go back to the moon with humans and to have a permanent base in the 2030s. They're also contesting prestige at the highest level, releasing a roadmap for Mars human exploration. And so, the hard truth number 7 is what they're doing is not about propaganda. This is about hard power, economic heft, the ability to coerce and to contest the US-led order by every means available. It's kind of like, the Maoist concept of a people's war, where you are providing alternate governance structure, slowly working your way up till you have the means to directly challenge. And so China's leadership has invested very significant reputational capital in public announcements, both with domestic and international consequences, and they have an astounding record of meeting their announced space goals, which my co-author, Dr. Namrata Goswami, has documented at quite some length. All right, and the final hard truth. The United States must either lead or kowtow. That, as you heard from Tyler, post-World War II, the United States set up a range of institutions to allow this. So importantly, we set up NATO for defense. We set up the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development and the Marshall Plan, which essentially built the developed world. We set up the World Bank, the IMF, put the dollar as the reserve currency, enabling the financing and the control of financing to our preferences. We set up the norms of freedom of overflight in the International Civil Aviation Organization. And domestically, we set up NASA, DARPA, the Air Force, the Federal Aviation Administration, the Airport Commission, the Eisenhower Highway System, that allowed us to develop infrastructure that was critical to economic growth at that time. The time that we're faced with now is to build the kind of economic means of production in space and to access and protect our access to resources that are going to make this possible for us and our children going forward. So the bottom line is that we either make a new international order in space, or we will be forced to follow what China sets up because of their extremely strong initiative in going about this. And if you're interested in like what is a get well plan, the U.S. Space Force, Air Force Research Lab, and Defense Innovation Unit just polled the sort of the titans of the space industrial world, and they're about to release within the month the State of the Space Industrial Base 2021, which has an extremely comprehensive set of recommendations of where the United States needs to go. And that's my final slide. Thank you very much. Oh, I should just say, if you're interested, there's the book where I go into all these things in tremendous depth. That's it.
Thank you, Peter. That was a great overview of where we're at, what is coming, whether we like it or not, in many cases. And a lot of these points that you made and the parallels you drew look very similar to the 1930s, when a lot of pundits, a lot of policymakers are saying, we've got our own problems at home. Don't worry about those weirdos in Europe that have great uniforms and funny armbands. And before we know it, we're embroiled in a worldwide conflict because steps that we could have taken earlier were taken too late. And all these institutions we've talked about were set up to prevent the next iteration of that. And now we're left with a system that maybe won't prevent the next conflict because it's not designed to do that for space. And so I want to talk now about that very fact, that what we have isn't designed for space. And what is it that we need, and how can we do that without needing to have or wait for the next global war and rebuild out of that. So want to, as you've heard here, the global international order that has existed for the better part of 100 years is fragile. It's under threat from a wide range of actors, internal and external. And it's ultimately not designed for use in a new environment where space has no international treaties, the rules of the road aren't set, and there is a almost borderless expanse where anything that happens in space affects the Earth, and we have no mechanism to ensure that countries play by rules. And so when we in the foreign policy community talk about these things, we're talking about how geography, economics, and demography affect what we do and how we do it in space. And so you've heard about how the effects of economics were shaped by what the US created after World War II, how security was influenced by institutions that were set up. And we were able to do this as a nation because we had the combination of a secure bastion away from the fighting that was undamaged post-World War II. We had an economy that had been tooled for mass industrial production of war materials that could then be rapidly retooled to produce the goods the world needed to rebuild. And we had a population that was nearly perfectly aged to ensure decades of productivity growth. And that combination is what ensured that the US was able to not only create these institutions, but preserve them over the decades. And so when we look at space, the geography of space is very different. We have the high ground, so to speak, being things as simple as low Earth orbit. And there's a number of articles and other papers that Peter has written about the high ground in space and the threat from malign actors there. But that's something that needs to be considered, that no longer can the US count on our geography and oceans separating us from conflicts abroad. No longer can we count on our economic position providing us a buffer and a runway to develop an industrial base to fight a future war. Because in space, as you heard, there's trillions of dollars of resources on single asteroids floating near to Earth. And while our demography remains one of the strongest in the world, we now have to contend with the fact that we are competing with a country that has the largest population in the world, and a plan for how to use that and deploy them to ensure their place in a new international order. So right now in space, the US has two primary tools that we deploy. We have NASA, which is statutorily mandated to discover the new, to push the bounds of what's possible and drive the advance of space technology. In many ways, the NASA is meant to be and does very well the leadership in scientific innovation around space. That's their purpose. We've begun to think of NASA as everything in space that doesn't wear a uniform. And so when we hear hotels in space, we hear gas stations in space, NASA is immediately associated with that. But we don't have that same framework on the ground when we think gas stations on the ground equals MIT. And so there's that missing link between the mundane, boring parts of life and NASA's mission and purpose. Space Force, the newer player for the US government in space, is meant to be that guarantor of US national security in space, to be the organization that protects our interest, deters aggression. And if there's one thing the US military does well, it's doing what it's told. And so while there's a lot of excitement about Space Force taking on missions that NASA may not be well suited for or desire to do, anything that involves building, creating, making, the military is not the institution for that. They are trained and honed to a fine point to defend, to fight, and to project power. And so expecting them to do the construction work and the labor involved in new institution creation would be to ensure that they are set up to fail at both missions. And so what's missing, as we saw when Tyler was talking about the types of institutions implemented after World War II, we're missing those organizations that can promote financial stability when we look into space, whether it's commodities exchanges, a international monetary fund equivalent, to ensure that there is a stable base for investments in space. Laws are required, be they property rights or others, and those are missing. Economic development organizations like the World Bank, to ensure that the handful of space players that exist now are not the ones that can monopolize all of the benefits of space, but that we can ensure we pull the rest of humanity with us, and that truly all boats may rise with the benefits of space and the abundance of resources there. And there's no organization or entity that has the responsibility or mandate to develop infrastructure to ensure that the access to the movement through and the economy of space is accessible. A quote I like to give is when Jeff Bezos talked about how he didn't build Amazon on his own. He was able to found Amazon and make it successful because someone else had built the roads, established the postal service, and given him those backbone pieces that people didn't necessarily think about, but that ultimately were the deciding factor in whether Amazon would be a success as a company. And so when we look to space, we need to examine what are those pieces of infrastructure that don't exist now that can enable the Amazons and like for space, those basic pieces that once built, we will likely forget are even impressive. We do that because while these discussions about infrastructure, and if you're in the DC area listening right now, infrastructure has been a theme now for the better part of a year. And it's discussed as an absolute good. Infrastructure is important, it's useful, and it pays dividends. And all of that is true. And it's our assertion that space infrastructure particularly returns far more than ground side infrastructure in terms of a dollar-to-dollar comparison. And that's because ultimately the construction of infrastructure in an entirely new domain of economic activity ensures that there is far more economic activity possible than the refurbishment of existing infrastructure. And we like to give an example of GPS to talk about how the scale of return that's possible for some basic components, in this case, navigation and timing of space infrastructure, being able to dramatically change the course of the US economy. And so one of the policy options that is currently circulating around the Hill right now is the Space Corporation. There's the bill, the Space Corporation Act of 2021, would create an infrastructure development corporation with a mandate to develop civil infrastructure for space. This corporation would seek to leverage the partnerships across government and internationally to ensure that any money spent was spent wisely and leveraged to the maximum extent possible with those partnerships and cooperations. But ultimately, it would be designed to ensure that the roads and rails, the sewers and power equivalents in space have a mechanism to fund their creation. And it would do that and seek to expand employment in the space economy nationwide. Our economic analysis suggests something on the order of 2.5 million new high-paying jobs would be created in the first 10 years of this organization's life. It would ease access to capital by buying down the risk for institutional investors and pension funds to be able to deploy those trillions of dollars of capital that exist in the US economic system that right now sit on the sidelines of space. And right now we have a handful of high net worth individuals and venture capital firms that provide nearly all of the capital for the space economy. And one of the most important components of this new organization, like the Bretton Woods Institutes of past, is it would reduce the political uncertainty involved in access to capital. Instead of requiring constant appropriations or returns to legislatures for new money, the Space Corporation would allow for a steady stream of investment by leveraging federal loan guarantees and bonding authority, so that way no new federal appropriations were needed. Ultimately, though, the Space Corporation is meant to be just the start. Just like many of the institutions that grew out of Bretton Woods, evolved over time from national ones to international ones, the Space Corporation is meant to be a model for new institutions that can help restore the benefits and promise of global integration and promote international economic cooperation in space. Because as we've heard, whether we like it or not, there is a competition for space. And the basic physics of it means those who control the high ground in space will have the ability to choose the time and place of a conflict in the future with almost absolute impunity. And so as we look to the future and make those comparisons to the Cold War and the competition with the Soviets, the US didn't beat the Soviet Union by training an army to go head to head with mass waves of infantry like the Russians were able to deploy. We didn't retool our entire economic system to be state-led, to compete with their 5-year plans and economic centralization. Instead, we realized that our strengths lie in the merger of Wall Street, Main Street, and Silicon Valley, when we can bring the capital markets of the West, combine that with the innovation of Silicon Valley and the productivity of the American worker, we outcompeted the Soviets without playing their game. Now, as we look to China, we have a similar situation between central economic planning, mass amounts of workers, and a military that is one of the largest in the world. We can try to compete at their game. We can try to scale economic and industrial capability, or we can recognize that our strengths lie in avoiding that conflict and competing on our own terms. So I'd like to close it there and open it for questions. Several of you have already put in questions. You can tweet them to us at F4F space on our Facebook page, F4F space. But we'll get started here real quick. Tyler, for you, the question that came up was, why should we have a US international order? Over the past decades, we have seen this international order cause harm, not live up to its promise in many instances. And so is it truly a good thing to perpetuate this, or does it cause more harm than good?
I would agree that it's definitely caused harm, but as we've seen with the events that led to World War I and World War II, the opposite of order is chaos. So in the absence of the US-led international order, I think the other alternative right now is chaos, because there's no other country that has the power or even the will to take our mantle. China may be the closest in power, but I don't think they have any desire to do so. And also, they're not a democratic nation, so why would we want them to take over our mantle?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, that if we don't lead, someone will. Peter, did you want to weigh in on that as well?
Well, I think, certainly we have to be humble about the fact that the order we set up has not been perfect, even against its own stated norms and values. But we can't lose sight of just how incredible a change this was. As you laid out, prior to the establishment of this order, it was a much, much worse, less stable world for almost all citizens. And it's also important to recognize that before we set up this world, the vast majority of states were not democracies. They did not have, human rights enshrined. These very ideas of liberty and democracy that seem so universal, we should be very skeptical that those would persist if the top power is an autocracy. That, that security community that we take for granted you know, if that collapses, we really do face a return, not to a multilateral world that might look very similar to today, but really to, a bunch of closed economic empires where regional autocratic powers dictate to others how things work.
Yeah, I think we tend to forget, because the vast majority of us have never known otherwise, that internationally we seem to regress to this chaotic autocracy, where not only is there not a respect for international norms and human rights, but respect for rules in general. The mighty take what they can, and the weak endure what they must. The second question that has come in, starting with you, Peter, was, I think this keyed in on one of the slides where you're talking about hypersonics. So the question was, in the Cold War, there was a lot of hype about the missile gap, about how the Soviet Union was pulling ahead. They were winning in the defense battle. And we later find out not quite as bad as it was portrayed. And so is there a similar situation going on now where there's, maybe China's a threat, but it's not as bad as we think, because most of what they're talking about is propaganda or hype?
Well, look, this is a bit of a Pascal's wager or gamble, because, obviously you always need to be skeptical of your intelligence and your bias. And that can lead you to, overspend resources when you don't need to. But on the other hand, you have to honor the fact that your opponent might get the upper hand. And what does that mean for you? And do you want to take the chance of putting yourself in a position, where you are just where you're non-optimally positioned? So, I tend to, in my own thinking on this, adopt a risk-based approach, and I prefer to, err on the side of caution, because the negative consequences are so high, and you really only get one shot. So, yes, you face the possibility of somewhat of a spiral in an arms race, but a spiral in an arms race is mostly just an economic cost to your overall, productivity. Arms races, there's not strong evidence that arms races result in war. They are a third option, rather than kowtow. If you can't come to an agreement, you want to make war impossible so that you can, continue through deterrence, so that you can continue to move forward. And so, in my view, an arms race is perhaps the best policy option you have in order to preserve the peace and the sort of world order that you want. So in my view, I think, you have to honor the intelligence that the threat is real until proven otherwise. And if that happens, great.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, that while there are costs for an arms buildup, it pales in comparison to the alternative. And I do think, in many ways, space is a little bit different, because we can see a lot more of what is happening. In Russia, you can shuffle around missile launchers and jet fighters. It's a lot harder to hide the fact that you're building a station in low Earth orbit right now. So there is that sort of verification that's possible. Did you want to weigh in on that, Tyler?
Yeah, so I think it's important to recognize the threat from China, whether it's inflated or not. But looking at not so much the arms race, but the space race, I don't think it's necessary to use fear of China as a motivating factor, because as we've seen from what Peter presented, expanding the space economy has nothing but benefits for the United States and whoever's involved. So why are we just now wanting to expand space because we're afraid that China is going to get there before we do. We should already have been doing this stuff for decades.
Yeah, I think that's an important point and a great one to close on, that whether or not we're competing with China militarily, the economic benefits of space are such that we are far better off expanding into space and then just having a military to secure that economic gain than sitting on the sidelines and letting someone else sort of South China Sea us out of space. Yeah, Peter.
Yeah, I would just like to add that in my perspective, the primary threat to the United States interests is not tactical space weapons. It is the strategic control of the means of production and the resources that provide, the wellspring of all national power, economic as well as military. And it's a mistake to focus on, on space weapons when the real competition is really over the future of wealth and freedom.
Yeah, I think that's important to note. And, that's been played out a number of times throughout human history, that control of the resources and means of production is what wars are fought over and what decides the futures of civilizations. So I think with that, we'll wrap up. We've not gotten any more questions in. So I want to thank you both for your time. This has been phenomenal. Again, for those of you listening out there, we will post the links in the descriptions for the books and where you can find out more. But thank you both for your time and look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.